So this man needs no introduction, as I know. So James, it's all you.
Should I get started? Look, I want to talk about, I really want to talk about team science today, but I want a particular sort of orientation toward this. And so I just call this simply team science and diversity because there are lots of implications for what's happening in terms of how we think about team science. And, but I think what's important for us, given the fact that we've tried to build this kind of diverse program with lots of people from different kinds of places, I thought I'd try to focus on some of those issues having to do with diversity and team science and kind of biomedical sciences training generally. So before starting, team science is kind of complicated. You'll see a lot of different examples of what that might mean, but the way in which we usually view it is defining it as any team-based research that involves two or more research groups, even if they're in the same institution. So you don't have to be in different institutions to talk about team science. And the idea is that you want it to result in an academic publication or other research output. So the biggest team that I ever worked with was 300 physicists who were trying to figure out, this must have been, oh God, 20 years ago, but helping them figure out how they could make decisions about publications. That was a big team science project, I can tell you that right now. So what's happening is that team science is about collaborative efforts to address scientific questions and challenges that kind of leverages the expertise and scientific acumen of the people who are involved in the particular teams. And the reason why team science is emerging as a norm is because I think I said this yesterday in our small group. Science is becoming more difficult, it's becoming more interdisciplinary, it's becoming tougher in terms of what you have to know. And in some ways, nothing's more tougher than what we're trying to do in terms of creating kind of biosocial cycle models of human behavior. And that creates lots of difficulties in terms of what you need to know. I'm going to talk a little bit about the roles of multiple mentoring and vertical research teams, how you put those together. That becomes an important issue, I think, in terms of the diversity issue. And we'll talk about the implications of team science, mainly for universities, because that's where most of you are, but it also has implications for research institutions, government, private funders, and so on. Next slide, Monica. Did you hear me? Monica?
I'm
Oh, I said next slide. I don't know how you do that. Hey, I got the little bottom now.
No.
All right.
Mhm.
So there's been an increase in team science over the years. I think it's no accident. Like I said before, science is becoming somewhat more complicated, and the kind of sciences that we do are really becoming more complicated. There's been an increase in scientific output over the years, measured in publications among science teams. You would find that to be kind of natural. Um, as an aside, by the way, that's had some impact on um, how we think about. I told my group yesterday that if I presented my same portfolio for tenure when I got tenure, which was in 1976, some of you may not have been born. Most of you were not probably. Um, that I never would have gotten tenure today with that portfolio. It just wouldn't have happened. It was just no way. Um, in fact, at that point in time, I was thinking my vita would never get to be beyond one page. But the fact is that just in terms of the amount of output that I was doing, and things have really changed over time. Now, there's a lot of challenges for team science. What's the diversity of membership, and how do we put together these diverse groups? How do we think about knowledge building across disciplines? Oftentimes it's very difficult, and one of the problems of doing cross-disciplinary research is that how do you build the kind of knowledge base you need so that you can communicate effectively across those. Some of the size of the teams have grown very large, even in the biomedical sciences. For example, the whole COVID-19 has increased internationally the kinds of teams that are working together. And one of the major problems they have to be able to work out is how are they going to work together in what particular sort of way. And the larger the teams become, the more difficult it is. You can get goal misalignment with other teams. That is, oftentimes the goals that teams have are not necessarily aligned with each other. Now, this happens a lot in certain kinds of business organization teams, but it also happens a lot with academic teams as well, in terms of what's happening. Sometimes the geographical dispersion of teams can create problems. For example, we're having a good example of that now with regard to everything being done virtual. And that can lead to lots of communication mistakes, misunderstandings, and things that you often can get worked out in a kind of a face-to-face situation that just take a lot longer in terms of the way in which we have to do things now. And the issue of task interdependency, which teams are going to be doing what, as you try to put all this together, is really a problem. So there are administrative, cultural, and organizational contexts for team science. Next slide. All right, this gives you just, I wanted to give you just a sense of the frequency of author team sizes across all fields in the biomedical sciences from 1960 to 2008, and the frequency of author sizes given on the y-axis. And as you can see, everything is growing. That is, the number of people who are working together are working and so on. Now, there's some countervailing forces that we'll talk to a little bit. That is, lots of questions because of this growth in team science. There are a lot of questions which are growing within the academy in terms of how do we make rewards to people when they're working in groups of 8 and 10 and 12 people. How do I make sense out of that? Next slide, Monica. So the larger academic and research context form the background of understanding the micro-institutional influences. And what I mean about that is that the issue with regard to the teams as we put them together are always formed in the larger academic and research context. Next slide. So just as an example, thinking about biomedical training, training for a career in biomedical research, and we often include our behavioral research as well, is just taking longer. Training is getting longer every year. Too many PhDs are being produced for the number of jobs that oftentimes takes advantage of this training. The average age of an investigator receiving his or her first NIH R01 is now approaching 42 years of age. That is, that's the average age for which a person gets their first R01. Now, these conditions may be indeed turning away the best and the brightest because people say, I don't want to wait that long before I get some of the rewards for working in this particular field. On the other hand, the enterprise has been immensely proactive and changes should be carefully considered. Next slide, Monica. This just gives you an example of US trained PhDs in academic employment by tenure track status. These are just examples, other life sciences, chemistry, to make the point I was making in terms of United States trained ones. And you can see is in some ways it's flattening out a little bit in the later years. Monica? This is the age distribution of the PhD workforce. As you know, this changes greatly by a lot of disciplines. For example, a lot of people don't know this, but the majority of nurses never make full professor. And one reason that's true is because by the time they're promoted to associate professor, they're actually closer to retirement than they are to the, and that has to do with regard to the nature of training and so on. For other kind of training, like in psychology, for example, you never see that happen. So disciplines differ. So while I'm making some general statements about disciplines, remember, all disciplines are not the same. Next slide. This is the age distribution as I talked about with regard to the NIH R01s. And the point I'm just making is that if you look at medical school faculty comparison to all R01s, you could see the differences as they're taking longer for more recently than they used to. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of diversity, I want to make a few points about that. It's clear that we live in an uneven playing field. And I gave you a reference for the Ginther article, which talks about why is it that African Americans are less likely to be successful in terms of getting NIH grants. A lot of research has come out on that. I've worked on that problem with her and other people, and I don't think we have the complete answer why that's true, but most of the hypotheses so far have been not fully proven. One of the more recent hypotheses is that the selection of topics that academics of color and researchers of color choose are not those that are favored within the NIH institutes and other places. So that indeed, that might account for why African Americans don't do as well. Because one thing we know is that African Americans, in comparison to other groups, particularly non-Hispanic whites, actually write better grants. I mean, they're better written grammatically, they're better written in terms of the content and the science. They're just better, but they fare worse in review and in terms of funding. Next slide, please. For example, the percentage of Blacks in full-time faculty ranks, to give you some idea, as you can see, the number of full professors is quite low, even in comparison to assistant professors and instructors. And one might say, well, things are going to get better. But if we look at the next slide, you'll see that doctoral students by race and ethnicity, it's almost like the more things change, the more things stay the same. So that there are not lots of young academics of color who are in training across the behavioral and social sciences or chemistry or clinical sciences and so on. So the problem is going to be with us for quite a while, as a matter of fact. Next slide, please. So the micro context, I want to talk a little bit about, this is a slide by Stokels, who's one of the big people working in the area of team science. And in his new book, he talks about a lot of the issues having to do with the influences on the effectiveness of team science. So let's focus in on organizational context for a few moments. I'm only going to take a couple of these. So organizational context for team science. Next slide, please. For example, for academic scientists, organizational promotion and tenure policies are an important part of the individual reward and the recognition system for researchers. So you can see that the percent of degree granting institutions with tenure has actually declined from 63% in 93, 94 to 45% in 2013. So that more and more institutions are actually not granting tenure. We had a conversation about this yesterday in our small group as well, and tenure in some ways is becoming more and more irrelevant. What's going to replace that? It's hard to say. So you can see only 34% of faculty today, in comparison to 78% and 69, are now tenured. If you only consider full-time instructors, the decline has been almost 56% from 93 to 94 to 2009. And what you're getting is much more adjunct and temporary arrangements with regard to people working in research and academic units. Next slide, please. So universities, by definition, are broader than the disciplines they're in. There's no other institution that makes this clearer than Arizona State. Sherry and I were talking about this yesterday because she's going on to Arizona State. But Arizona State, in some ways, have blurred the boundaries of what they call disciplines by creating things that are larger than departments. And they call them schools, actually. So tenure and promotion policies are going to have to fit a broad set of academicians from all these particular kinds of areas. And I'm telling you that the challenges for how we understand things within these new organizational contexts are going to be very difficult. So what constitutes success in a promotion and tenure today has always varied by different disciplines, but how much variation can be tolerated within one particular institution. So, for example, what it takes in order to become tenured in the humanities is going to be a book or two, and having a book or two in the social and behavioral sciences is actually more of a hindrance than it is to facilitate promotion and so on. Next slide, please. So the question is, do these guidelines matter? This is Kira Hall. I borrowed one of her slides. Do they affect cultural change, or do cultural change affect these particular policies? And what are the roles of these policies in influencing the way faculty are evaluated? Next slide, please. So these are some examples of contextual influences. What are the funding priorities out there for government agencies? What are the academic structures that you're located in? How do we think about institutional leadership and culture? What about unit leadership and culture and policy and guideline language that is used with regard to the institution that you're in? Because each and every institution will be somewhat different with regard to how you understand it. Next slide, please. So Hall has done a lot of work on CTSA institutions. These are institutions which have these big medical school CTSA programs, and has found things like the criteria are not specific to team science. That is, the traditional kinds of criteria don't necessarily fit what's happening with regard to research and what's particularly happened to the research in the academy, as well as in actually business organizations and other kinds of things. You know, how do we think about co-authorship, for example? How do we think about being a co-PI or a PI on a grant? It doesn't, what's happening today with multiple PIs and other kinds of things, particularly when people are separated, is changing the nature of how we think about these things within any given institution. So only a handful of institutions offered non-traditional criteria. So while things are becoming non-traditional in terms of the research that has to be done, what you find out though is that that's a disjuncture with regard to what the kind of criteria are for promotion, for raises, and for other kinds of things. But these things, which are not counted and not counted in the right kind of way, are critical to the kind of research that you're going to be doing and you're going to be working on. Next slide, please. That's the conundrum that we have. So what we need is a clarity of terms. We need to think about what is interdisciplinary research team science, because we really don't know what interdisciplinary research means. That's one of those terms that's thrown around a lot, but it's not clear. We have to clarify what collaborative, multidisciplinary research means. How do we understand team science? I gave you an example of that, but it's not the most satisfying example I could give you. How do we get what's going on in reality in terms of team science to be juxtaposed in terms of the criteria for what it means to excel in your field, what it means to become successful, and so on. And that causes all kinds of difficulties, including scientific activities, team processes, and so on. What we want, just I want to emphasize this, are unambiguous terms with numerous clear criteria, objective metrics, and explicit strategies for demonstrating meaningful factors related to advancing science in this growing collaborative context. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of recommendations. I want you to think about this in terms of the kind of background of this. We just have to codify, develop, and disseminate evidence-based about how individual researchers most effectively meet scientific benchmarks in the team context. I mean, how do you, as an individual scientist, meet effectively these kind of scientific benchmarks? And we need to identify factors that are essential and unique to the collaborative science. And what I mean really about this page, the whole page, is how do we count what your contributions are within a team science kind of focus versus an old-fashioned notion of the individual scientist working with their microscope in a particular laboratory. That's just not the way things are anymore. Next slide, please. There are related organizational contexts. I'm going to give you one example of that. Research institutions and centers, industry, academic collaborations, all of these things are different, and they all have impact on what it means to be successful. And I don't want to go into a lot of stuff on this. There are chapters that have been written on this like crazy. In fact, I think there's a 700-page book that just came out. That's also on your list. You can get that read by tomorrow. Next page, please. It is 700 pages. So there's some new approaches out there. University of Southern California is trying to set guidelines that explicitly recognize the major elements of team science. That is, how do we give credit to people who are working in these particularly large, complicated, cross-disciplinary teams? And by the way, none of the things I'm going to talk about, I'll give some other examples too, have been particularly successful at this point. They're all, this is a very, very difficult problem. Next page, please. Other institutions include Case Western, I mentioned Arizona State, which is probably the most adventuresome, and the University of Michigan, by the way, and the Institute for Social Research that I used to direct a long time ago, um, really has attempted over its lifespan, about 80 years, to do team science. We didn't call it team science back in the day, but that's exactly what we tried to do, and to create opportunities for people who are not in academic disciplines to be able to be successful within the research enterprise. Next slide, please. So again, just to look at the physical environment is another example. I'm going to run through this very quickly, Monica. Next page, please. So Owen Smith wrote an interesting book, which is called A Tale of Two Buildings, Social Spatial Significance. And the point here is that spatial issues can be important with regard to team science, sharing a building, and so on. And the next slide is a pretty slide, I think. Nope. So we don't know very much about this yet. It suggests complicated contingent effects. We don't know exactly what it means to put people together in certain ways. And I got one example of one slide, please. Monica, you can keep going. Oh, look at that. That's the slide I'm talking about. So in this slide, Owen Smith has done studies where he's looked at how do you arrange different kinds of research groups to get maximal maximal cooperation among those groups and to be more productive than not. So some initial research suggests strongly that indeed that particular arrangement can then actually increase the productivity in and of itself, no matter what else you do. Next slide. The theory is underdeveloped. We need long-term longitudinal studies, and we're just not there yet. But there seems to be something going on in terms of being able to put various different teams doing different things together. Next slide, please. Let's go to the next one too. So I have some concluding slides, several of them. So first, science problems are only going to increase in complexity and the expense needed to address these problems. So far, science teams have been successful in spite of the lack of attention to, for example, we solved the problem of the 300 physicists who all wanted to be on one publication, and we could solve these particular problems. More research attention is needed, though, in terms of how this works. The small number of organizational experiments thus far gives us really limited guidance about how we do this. Next slide. So training models for scientists will have to be adapted to meet this new organization scientific research environment. The traditional frameworks of individual and group-based contributions are going to have to be modified. They just don't work with regard to current things that we do within institutions like the academy. What counts as scientific products may need to be enlarged. That is, what counts as an outcome will have to be enlarged. Researchers are going to need to make conscious decisions about involvement in team science, whether with an interdisciplinary focus or not. In fact, I think it's going to be hard to avoid in the future, given the fact of all the things that we need to know in order to address the problems that we're interested in. We may need to reevaluate what constitutes paths to success. Next slide, please. So policies of rewards, especially promotion and tenure in universities, will have to be changed. business firms are going to have to change what they think of as private consultation frameworks. That is, what's considered to be off limits and not talked about because of proprietary issues is going to have to be changed. And we're going to have alternate organizational structures. Next slide, please. So how does the diverse early career research scientist kind of fit into this? Because as I showed you before, the numbers of diverse scientists are small. While that number is increasing somewhat, as I showed you in some of the early slides, they're not increasing as fast as what we'd like. And as many of you have talked about since MIWI got started, you know, a lot of you are located in very lonely locations, you know, where you may be the only faculty member of color within that particular location. And that's a very difficult situation to work in. But we're going to have to adapt the training models for how we think about this. Maybe we need more programs like MIWI. Maybe we need more ways of thinking about how we create these particular supports. But we know that traditional frameworks of individual and group-based contributions are going to have to be modified. You're going to change about what you think about that. As I said, what counts as scientific products are going to be enlarged, and we're going to have to make conscious decisions about involvement in team science, and we're going to have to reevaluate what constitutes fast success. Next slide, please. I think that's the last one. And I have a set of references. We'll get this to you, the presentation, so you can have the references too as well. I was involved with a lot of these, so I know about it. Okay, I didn't want to go too fast, but I think I went fast enough.
Yep,
Is that good? Is that good timing for you?
That was perfect, and we have so many questions.
Okay.
So again, thank you, James, so much. I'm going to start at the top. So, and I know these are very big questions, and I've already put in the chat that I'm going to send them to all the small group leaders too, because I don't know that I think it's helpful to kind of hear everybody's perspective on this. But, you know, given that our scholars are kind of starting out, do you have, you know, what strategies do you suggest for developing a fundable, like NIH fundable portfolio in this environment? You know, should there be an emphasis on identifying senior mentors? Just sort of where should they be investing their energy?
Yeah, I think that's a hard question that came up in our small group yesterday a little bit, and I think even if we make some progress on that, in terms of thinking about that, having people come to some conclusions about it, this program is going to be successful. It is very difficult to think about how you do that. And in some ways, it revolves around all the questions having to do with team science. Who gets credit for what, in what particular sort of way? How do you think about working with a more senior person for whom the field may look at and said, well, I know that person really did the work, but you didn't do the work. How do we think about negotiating from differential positions of power? That is, being a young person, having conversations with more senior people in the field that you really need to be working with, by the way, because they do have knowledge and understanding. But one of the things I think is important is communication without stupidity. And what I mean by that is that if you're working with a very senior faculty member, I think it's very important to communicate your concerns and make sure you get things straight at the beginning and when you start, but you can't be stupid about it in terms of going in, demanding things and so on. The academy is actually a very hierarchical place, and you have to kind of understand that. and you have to kind of respect that hierarchy, and you have to understand it and respect it. But at the same time, I think it's very important for young people um, to have these understandings up front. You know, don't wait until the paper is finished to make a decision about, well, who's going to be the first author.
Right.
No, that
Right.
doesn't, that's not going to work.
Right.
Be very careful with regard to specifying what the roles are, what the expectations of the people that you're, particularly senior people that you're working with, of you and what you're supposed to be doing. And their willingness to accept this is going to be very important. I don't know how to put this exactly. I'm a psychologist, so uh, unfortunately, personality factors play a role in all of this too as well. And how can I put this? There's some senior people who are real asses. That's a technical term.
Technical term.
Yeah, you really have to be able to recognize that. Every senior person out there will not necessarily have your best interests at heart. You're going to have to figure out a way in which you can ascertain whether that person really has your interest at heart. If they're trying to help you, they're trying to help you be successful in one particular sort of way. Get as much information as you can, always, side information, and so on. You may not use that information. You may indeed have to check things out for yourself. But whatever you do, don't walk into circumstances blindly, thinking that everybody is the same, that everyone was as great as your mentor was in graduate school. That's a little joke, by the way, or worse. But to think about with regard to the fact that they're going to be different in some sort of ways. Let me stop talking because that's a question I could talk about forever.
I think there's a couple of questions that are similar, which I think for many of our scholars are at places where they may not have senior people working with them or readily available. And, one obviously is like, this is why we have MeWe. This is part of the piece here, but I don't know if you have suggestions about, like, let me frame it this way. Have you been reached out to by people at smaller institutions, and sort of how do you approach, as a senior person, how do you approach those potential collaborations with more junior scientists?
Yeah, I'm kind of smiling about that. We try to create networks. This is a very important network. We don't see this network as going away, but instead we see it, if anything, expanding. The Program for Research on Black Americans, which, oh my God, I helped create 40 years ago, 45 years ago. Through that network of people and so on, I probably trained close to 300 or 400 people through that particular network. And in many cases, these were people who were not at the University of Michigan, but instead were at other locations and places. We create research groups like SNOD. She knows what SNOD means for social neuroscience of health disparities, in which I think we were very effective with postdocs and so on over the years. 20, 25 people have worked with us through that process. But again, trying to create spaces and having some understanding, particularly with regard to young faculty of color, like I said before, who may be in very lonely kind of places. They're in departments for which they're the only one. Some of them are even in colleges, in which they're the only one. So as a senior person in the field, I've always felt that we've had some responsibility to reach out and to be of assistance. I've always tried to pass that down to my students. And, I think we've been pretty effective with that. And I have students everywhere, by the way, which I'd be happy to tell anybody about. UCLA and Harvard, and all kinds of different kind of places. So we could be helpful there too as well.
Can you talk briefly about how PRBA was kind of able to garner the institutional support for that effort?
Yeah, that was hard. What I did, I was young. You got to remember that. So what I'm going to say, I just told my social science colleagues at the ISR that for the last 50 years, they had been doing bad research on the African American population. That's before I learned the lesson of being political in the conversation, and that there were better ways in which we could do research on issues of color and race. The second issue is that these issues of ethnicity and color and race, which I was interested in, were issues of real substance to the social and behavioral sciences. And I spent the next 50 years pretty much convincing people of that, and that it had to be a substantive aspect of problems that we studied in the social and behavioral sciences. And once we got people thinking a little bit about that, it was like a snowball rolling down a hill. And I think today, people wouldn't even question that in my department anymore as an issue. They accept it. And of course, what followed from that was their willingness to hire people of color to work within that thing. And of course, to their surprise, the rankings of the department actually went up rather than going down. They always thought that was kind of interesting. You got another question for me? Because again, I could talk about that forever.
I will ask our scholars to kind of weigh in here. We got about 10 minutes left.
Right.
So I think, again, we'll save this chat and I'll send it out, but I want to see, just as these conversations unfolding, what other things are coming up.
I can't see everybody, but I see some people. You can ask any questions about this. About team science. I didn't mean to rush through it too much, but you know.
Dr. Jackson, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. And Bree asked part of this larger question I was thinking about earlier with respect to thinking about the funding landscapes, the realities by kind of race and age that we're kind of, really trying to navigate and in some ways up against when considering applying for funding at NIH. If you could just talk to us about what might we think about as part of that strategy. So the navigating relationships with senior scholars is part of that, but earlier in our careers, pre-tenure in particular, might we consider other funders as a means or a strategy of kind of building our program and portfolio of research and then come back to NIH later? What are your thoughts about how to really set ourselves up for success and maybe not? If we should invest our energies at NIH early, or if that's something we should save for later in our careers.
There are many opportunities that are opening at NIH for young investigators. They actually are working hard. I used to be on the NIH directors advisory panel, actually, and we established quite a few programs for young investigators to get them started with regard to what they were doing, whether the R99s or other kinds of grants and so on that are out there. So there are real opportunities there. I think one of the difficulties we have is that there's a tendency, and particularly among young scholars of color, not to talk enough with regard to the scientists within NIH. There's this tendency to think there's something wrong with that. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. You should get as much information as you possibly can. You need to be able to have access to successful examples of, that is, people's applications that have been successful in terms of what you're doing, to note what those elements are, talk to other investigators of a similar age as yours who are maybe a little ahead, who were successful in terms of what they're getting. I really think we don't do enough of that kind of thing. Secondly, serendipity plays a very important role in terms of your success. And I know people don't like to hear that. They like to think that they have things under control and it's planful and they're doing this, but that's not always true. A lot of times opportunities just will kind of come along. For example, I don't think enough young scholars of color look at the National Science Foundation as a possibility for funding. We have this kind of orientation toward NIH for a lot of reasons. Most of my funding over the years has come from NIH, but the National Science Foundation is a place to look at. There are other places which have funding, including the Department of Defense, DARPA, other kinds of places where they're doing lots of behavioral science research. In fact, I don't know if you know it or not, but the Department of Army, I think the Army does almost as much cancer research as the Cancer Institute. And, those are the kinds of things that are there. You also can think out of the box with regard to the kinds of institutions that you may be interested in. For example, one might be oriented toward NIMH because of an interest in mental health, but at the same time, National Heart, Blood, and Lung Institute may also have a program that might be of some interest. So be very careful about limiting yourself too quickly in terms of what's going on. But the more people you can talk to, the more information you can get, the more great examples you can get of people who are successful, then I think the more the opportunity for you to be able to do it. And of course, the private foundations are difficult for two reasons, and hopefully we can talk about that at some point. Nobody likes private foundation grants except for the investigators. And the reason for that is they're complicated, but they don't pay enough overhead. And overhead is an important part of what makes universities run. And you oftentimes will get a lot of pushback. For example, I was dealing with a young guy today, a young scholar, and he got 2 small grants, and it would really help him a lot, but the university wouldn't accept them. So that was a fight that we had. Thank God we won the fight, but they didn't want to accept them because they said, look, the overhead of dealing with this grant is cost more than it would be to administer the grant, that it would cost us money to be able to do that.
Yeah.
So one has to be careful about those kind of foundation grants. Some are so prestigious that it's not a problem, but some of the others cause you some difficulties. But that's something maybe we can talk about in our small group today. But that's an important question.
I think that's a really good point, especially as if people are kind of think, because I think on the one hand you think, oh, it's small, I just need $20,000, $50,000. But I couldn't agree more. One, at Michigan, you have to get permission to even submit to a foundation that isn't going to pay the full overhead. So your university may not even allow, at Michigan, may not even allow you to submit the application if it doesn't have overhead. The second is that these foundation grants are all their own unique little snowflake that have their own unique little requirements, page requirements, formatting, whatever. It's a nightmare. An NIH grant is the exact, literally, I just have it. That's my default. 1/2-inch margins, Arial font, size 11. That's what it is, right? And now it is a steep learning curve to write that first one, but man, after that, it's not even close. I get so frustrated. I just got a foundation grant like last month, and that's the third thing I wanted to say is so it was like, well, how do I do this? The third thing is that foundation grants often don't give you any feedback. You will just hear no, and that is all you will hear. And that is incredibly frustrating. And so, especially when you've created it so it's this special little snowflake. So I'm in my experience, and to James's point, like I know that they feel appealing, but they and the other point you made is talking to program. So not just the having a conversation with the foundation program officers, having a foundation with your program officer at NIH. I mean, I would not have gotten my K award without my program officer at 100%. I mean, literally it was caught by sequestration, which is when the government shut down one of the times, wasn't funded. I went on maternity leave and I got a call from my PO a month after my son was born saying, can you still do the project? And I said, what are you talking about, Mark? Like, yeah, what project? Like, because it was its second submission and I was running out of time. I didn't have any more time left on the clock. And he said, I put it back in. Can you do it? So, and he was he's like, I believe in you. I believe in your team. Like, this is not, you got caught up in this, but it scored like a 36 or something. It wasn't phenomenal. It didn't score phenomenal, but it under other circumstances, it would have been funded, but again, he believed in me because I had gotten over myself and my anxiety and called up Mark Chavez and said, can I talk to you about this idea? I don't know if it's dumb or not, and he's like I don't know, you probably don't know, but there was this commercial Micro Machines. There were these tiny little cars and there was the guy, you could Google it later, but the commercials for these Micro Machines, the man would speak incredibly quickly. And that's how Mark Chavez was. Like, I would literally have to just tape record my calls with him because I couldn't understand everything he was saying. And you can see how fast I talk. And it was just like three L's, but I couldn't emphasize that enough.
I used to tape record our meetings because I had to replay it later on.
Yes.
You should always talk fast like that.
So we are now at time. So I want to make sure that we have our full hour for lunch. I am going to save the chat and we'll circulate these questions for our small groups and I encourage you I will send a message to all the directors. Obviously James is here and I'm here, but to Cleo and Robert to make sure to address some of these questions today. That'll probably happen differently for different directors, but please join me in thanking James for this fantastic talk. Just thank you so much, James, we greatly appreciate it. And the resources, the citations that he provided, the list of those is on Canvas, and Monica and I will work on tracking down those documents, the actual documents themselves as we move forward. So thank you.
I have the Academy one if you can.
Oh, good. Okay, all right. So everyone, that is a break for lunch. We will see you in an hour for Jessica Fowle talking to us about population data collecting biomarkers, something. I don't know, biomarkers. And again, thank you so much, James. We appreciate it. And I'll see everybody in an hour.
Okay. Right. Are we going to have are we going to park some things like in terms of talking here about like K awards and there are a lot of common questions.
Yes, yeah. We have so they've been very active on the Slack, James. Right. So I can add you to that, but we can also just have it through the Canvas site as well. Because they're on Slack. We also have Canvas, and we're trying to kind of mirror them both. I think that probably, my guess is, this is something you'll get asked on Friday when Monica sends out the survey, is like, which of these do you want to kind of keep using primarily for ongoing communication? But I agree, like as we kind of continue to find these additional resources and additional questions.
Yeah, because we want to know what you're interested in.
Yes.
And I was just saying, let's put some things in the parking lot and then pull those things out as we go along, because there's a lot of common issues across, even though your interest topics are going to be different. There's some common things about how you select mentors, how do you think about, how you put those people together, how do you work with them, all those kinds of issues, which are going to be common or fairly common. All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm going to shut up now.
All right, thanks,
Right.
everybody. We will continue this conversation later. Thank you, James.
And
All
then we
right,
have our small groups at 2:30, right, Monica?
2:45.
Oh, 2:45.
We moved
Okay.
it.
I'll
but-
see my group at 2:45.
Thank you, everybody.
Look forward to it. Bye-bye.